The last thing Daniel Marsh wrote before he disappeared from the official record was a question, not a statement. He wrote it in a steady hand, no smudging, no hesitation, like a man filling out a form. He wrote, "I know I recognized it. I've spent 3 days trying to figure out from where. And I'm starting to hope, genuinely hope, that I never remember." That's what gets me every time I come back to this file. Not the missing pages, not the sealed buildings, not even what the other workers reported when they went up that same road after him. It's the handwriting. Because a man who has just seen something that breaks him doesn't write in a steady hand. He shakes. He presses too hard. He tears the page a little at the corner. Daniel's handwriting didn't change at all. And I've been doing this long enough to know that the stillness in that pen means something much worse than fear. My name doesn't matter for the purposes of this account. What matters is that I work with recovered documents, welfare records, field surveys, the kind of paperwork that gets filed and forgotten in regional archive systems and never cross-referenced with anything else. Most of what I read is genuinely boring. Crop assessments, infrastructure reports, mileage claims. Occasionally, something surfaces that doesn't sit right. A report with a gap where there shouldn't be one. A file that's been routed through 3 different offices without anyone leaving a note explaining why. When that happens, I pull the thread. Usually it leads nowhere interesting. Usually it's just administrative sloppiness or a junior clerk who didn't know the correct form. But once, maybe twice in a career like this, you pull the thread and the whole thing moves. The whole file shifts, like something on the other end noticed you pulling. That's what happened with Daniel Marsh and the place called Calvert's Hollow. The file on Daniel came to me sideways, the way the interesting ones always do. It was attached to a routine archive transfer, bundled with 40 other welfare survey records from a regional resettlement office that had been absorbed into a larger administrative body and was clearing its backlog. Most of those 40 files were exactly what they looked like. Daniel's was not. It was thicker than it should have been, and the thickness came from the wrong place. A welfare field survey doesn't generate private correspondence. It doesn't generate a personal journal. But tucked behind Daniel's official submission in a plain manila folder with no routing label and no date stamp were 2 other documents. A set of letters addressed to someone named Claire, written in the same clean hand as the survey, but in a completely different register. Looser, more honest, like a man talking to himself, with his sister's name at the top of the page. And a journal, spiral-bound, the kind you buy at a pharmacy, with a broken clasp and water damage on the lower right corner of about 1/3 of the pages. I sat with all 3 documents for about an hour before I started reading in any systematic way. I wanted to get a sense of the shape of the thing first, the way you look at a map before you start tracing a route. The official survey was thorough, clean language, careful observation, the kind of report a genuinely competent field worker produces. Except for one section. 11 pages covering the 2nd and 3rd nights of Daniel's stay at Calvert's Hollow had been removed. Not lost, removed. The cut was made with something straight-edged, a blade or a ruler, pressed firmly against the binding so the pages came away cleanly without disturbing the spine. Someone had done this after the report was already bound. Someone had sat down with Daniel's finished work, opened it to the right section, and taken a knife to it. The routing stamp on the cover page was from the regional authority's own office, which means whoever removed those pages had access to the file after it was submitted and before it was archived. I've been thinking about that sequence ever since. The journal covers the same period the official survey covers, but it covers it differently. The handwriting in the early entries, the days before Daniel drove up the service road to Calvert's Hollow, is relaxed and even. He writes about the drive, about a diner where the coffee was surprisingly good, about a phone call with Claire where she told him he worked too much, and he agreed without meaning it. He sounds, in those early pages, like a completely ordinary person doing a slightly dull job in a remote area. There's no sense of what's coming. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I think it makes it worse, because I read enough of what comes later to know that the man writing those easy, comfortable sentences about decent coffee in his sister's voice had no idea that within 72 hours he would be sitting in a car on a dark road with no headlights on, not because the headlights were broken, but because he had forgotten somewhere in the process of leaving Calvert's Hollow that lights were a thing that existed and that he was allowed to use them. If this kind of account is something you want to keep following, please subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps me keep putting these files in front of people who should probably know about them. The first thing I noticed about Daniel, beyond his professional record, was what was missing from it. He had been conducting field assessments in rural and semi-rural communities for nearly a decade. His previous reports were consistent, competent, and completely unremarkable, which in welfare documentation is high praise. He wrote about difficult conditions without dramatizing them. He had filed reports on communities dealing with prolonged unemployment, environmental damage, infrastructure failure, the kind of chronic, slow-moving hardship that doesn't make news but grinds people down over years. He described all of it with the same measured tone, not cold, just calibrated. The tone of someone who has learned that the most useful thing he can offer a suffering community is accurate observation, not sentiment. I found one note in his personnel file that stuck with me, a supervisor's quarterly review, maybe 3 years before the Calvert's Hollow survey. The supervisor wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here because the original phrasing was more bureaucratic, that Daniel's greatest professional strength was his ability to remain objective in conditions that would cause other workers to over-identify with what they were seeing, that he could look at something hard and report it cleanly without the report becoming about his reaction to it. That's exactly the kind of person you want doing field welfare work in difficult communities. That's also exactly the kind of person whose account becomes impossible to dismiss when the report starts falling apart. Because a man like that doesn't fall apart easily. And his journal, from the second night onward, falls apart completely. Not in the sense of becoming emotional, in the sense of becoming something that the man I just described, the calibrated, steady, decade-experienced professional, should not have been capable of writing. The entries don't read like a breakdown. They read like a translation, like Daniel was trying to put into the only language he had something that the language was not built to carry. And the thing that keeps me coming back to this file, the thing I cannot stop thinking about, is that he almost managed it. The woman who first told Daniel about Calvert's Hollow couldn't look him in the eye for the entire conversation, and I don't think she even noticed she was doing it. That detail is in Daniel's journal, not in the official survey. In the survey, she's just a source contact, referenced by first name only, Ruth, a welfare coordinator working out of a regional hub office about 3 hours south of where the service road begins. In the journal, she gets a full paragraph. Daniel wrote that she was the kind of person who had probably been competent and steady for a long time, and that something had quietly used that competence up. He wrote that she moved through the office like someone who had learned to make herself small in a specific room and had forgotten how to stop doing it anywhere else. He met her on what was supposed to be a routine briefing day. He was being handed a stack of survey assignments for the Northern Territories, communities that hadn't been assessed in over a year, the usual backlog that accumulates when a regional office is understaffed and underfunded, which is to say, always. Ruth walked him through the assignments one by one, efficient, thorough, her eyes on the papers the whole time. Calvert's Hollow came up near the end of the list. She described it the way you describe something you've rehearsed describing. A log-in settlement up a decommissioned service road, maybe a few hours north of the main route. Residents had not responded to the last 2 outreach attempts. Supply drops left at the road boundary had been collected. Crates returned empty. No direct contact established. She said all this to her paperwork, not to Daniel, to the papers in her hands. He noticed. He wrote. She knew exactly which file she was on, without looking at the label. She'd handled that folder enough times that her fingers knew it. He asked her, in the most ordinary way, why no follow-up had been scheduled after 2 failed contact attempts. Standard protocol would have triggered an escalation after the first missed response. She said weather conditions made access unreliable. He looked out the window behind her desk. The sky that afternoon was completely clear, the kind of flat, bright, cloudless sky that makes distances look smaller than they are. He didn't say anything about the sky. He wrote about it that night. He wrote, quote, "That's the moment I keep returning to, not because Ruth did anything wrong exactly, but because of what it tells you about how these things persist. Nobody covered anything up in any dramatic way. There was no meeting, no decision, no coordinated silence. It was just a woman who had learned not to ask certain questions about a certain folder, and who felt something release in her chest when a new field worker took it without pushing, and who went home that evening and probably slept better than she had in months. That's all it takes. That's how a place like Calvert's Hollow stays off the active map. Not through conspiracy, through a series of small personal decisions made by tired people who just wanted the folder to be someone else's problem. Daniel left for the Northern Territories 2 days later. He had 6 survey assignments. Calvert's Hollow was 5th on his list. Now here is where things start to shift, and I want you to stay with me on this because it's easy to read what comes next as atmosphere, as Daniel being a little tired, a little suggestible after days of driving through empty country. I read it that way the first time. I don't read it that way anymore. The service road to Calvert's Hollow is not on current maps. It was removed from operational cartography in a routine update that Daniel's file predates, which means when he drove it, it still appeared as a valid access route on the regional survey grid. He turned onto it on a gray mid-morning, the sky the color of old concrete, the kind of sky that feels lower than it actually is, like a ceiling that's been dropping gradually, and you haven't noticed until the room feels wrong. He noted the road surface in the survey, compacted gravel, showing minimal maintenance, passable but requiring reduced speed through sections where frost had worked the substrate up into ridges. Practical, professional, precise. In the journal, he wrote something different. He wrote that the road felt like it was allowing him to proceed. He crossed that out and wrote it again. He left it the second time. The first thing he registered as genuinely wrong was the mud at the road's edge. He had pulled over briefly to check a reference on his survey map. And while he was stopped, he looked out at the shoulder, at the soft ground between the gravel and the tree line. It was the kind of soil that holds impressions clearly, fine-grained, damp, the surface not yet frozen hard. There was nothing in it. No deer tracks, no bird landings, not the thin, paired prints of a rabbit moving through. He had driven survey routes in similar terrain through 2 full winters. He knew what that mud was supposed to look like. It was supposed to be a record of everything that had moved through in the last day or two, a kind of natural ledger. This mud was completely blank. He stood beside the car for a moment looking at it, and then he looked into the trees, and then he got back in and kept driving. He did not write about what he felt standing there. He only wrote what he saw. But the fact that he stopped writing at exactly that point, that the sentence ends with him getting back into the car and the next sentence is about the smoke, tells me everything I need to know about what standing at the edge of that blank mud actually felt like. The smoke reached him before the buildings did. It came through his slightly cracked window, and it was wrong in a way that took him a moment to identify. Not the clean wood fire smell of a functioning hearth, something heavier, greener, like timber that hadn't fully dried being burned at a low and deliberate heat. The smell of something being sustained rather than consumed. He rolled the window up and then, after a few seconds, rolled it back down because some part of him, the part that had been doing this job for nearly a decade, needed to keep gathering information, even when the information felt like a hand pressing gently against his chest, pushing back. When the trees finally broke and Daniel saw the village for the first time, he stopped the car so hard that gravel popped under the tires and scattered into the ditch. Not because something jumped out at him, not because the road ended. He stopped because every single window he could see had been covered over, completely, methodically, with horizontal planks laid tight against the frames, and then vertical planks over those, and then what looked like a third layer in some places, and every plank held in place by nails driven at intervals so regular they looked measured. He sat there with the engine running and counted the windows on the nearest building. 6 windows. He estimated later that each one had been sealed with somewhere between 40 and 60 nails. He wrote that number down in the journal and then wrote next to it, __, quote, _3, __. He let the engine idle for a while. He has no note of how long. In the survey, he describes this pause as a preliminary assessment period. In the journal, he does not give it a name at all. He just writes what he observed, building by building, moving his eyes across the settlement the way you scan a room when you walk into it, and something feels off, but you can't immediately place what. Every structure visible from his position at the road had been treated the same way. The doors were worse than the windows. The doors had the planks and then, on several of them, additional hardware, steel brackets, heavy bolt plates. On one door, the nearest one to where he had stopped, someone had mounted what looked like a pair of gate hinges in reverse, the kind designed to keep something from pushing through from outside, but oriented to hold the door closed from within. He wrote, "The reinforcement on that door is rated for livestock pressure. Someone applied it to a residential entry on the interior side. I am having difficulty constructing a charitable explanation for this." That sentence, that careful, professional, almost funny sentence, is one of the things I keep coming back to, because it's Daniel doing what Daniel does, reaching for the rational framework, looking for the explanation that makes this normal. And the fact that he wrote it down means he was aware he was doing it. He knew he was stalling. He got out of the car anyway. The cold hit him differently than it had on the road. He wrote that the air inside the settlement felt several degrees lower than it had at the tree line, which is not how temperature works in an open space on a gray afternoon. He stood beside the car for a moment and breathed it in, that heavy green timber smoke that had been following him since the last bend in the road, and underneath it, something else, something mineral and faintly damp, like the smell of a basement that hasn't been opened in a long season. He took his survey bag from the back seat, clipped his lanyard to his jacket, and walked toward the nearest building. His footsteps on the gravel sounded too loud. He noticed that. He slowed down without deciding to. He was maybe 4 meters from the braced door when a voice came through it. Not through the gap under the door, not through any crack he could identify from where he was standing. Through the wood itself, it seemed, the way sound carries through walls when the house is very quiet and the person on the other side is close to the surface. A woman's voice, older, unhurried, like someone who had said difficult things many times and had stopped needing to soften them. She said, quote, 5. Daniel looked at his watch. It was not yet midday. He had hours of light. He told her who he was and why he had come, the same way he always introduced himself on field visits. His name, the authority he worked for, the purpose of the welfare assessment, the resources that could be arranged if the community needed them. He spoke for maybe 2 minutes to a door covered in planks and iron brackets. When he finished, the woman said, quote, 6. He asked how long the buildings had been sealed. She said, quote, 7. He asked what the ceiling was for. There was a pause, long enough that he thought she had stepped away from the door. Then her voice came back, lower than before, not quieter exactly, lower, like she had dropped the register deliberately. She said, quote, 8. Daniel wrote that sentence that night with a box drawn around it in the margin. Not a question mark, not a notation, just a box. The way you mark something you need to come back to because you don't have the right category for it yet. He tried to keep the conversation going. He asked how many residents were currently in the settlement. She said she wasn't sure of the exact number, which is the kind of answer that sounds evasive unless you consider that a community living the way Calvert's Hollow was living might genuinely have lost precise track of itself over time. He asked if there were children. A pause. Then, some. He asked if anyone needed medical attention. She said, not the kind you could arrange. He asked if he could speak with someone else, a community representative, anyone who might be able to give him a clearer picture of the settlement's needs. The woman said, quote, 11. He asked her name. She said, quote, 12. Nothing else. No surname, no elaboration. He stood at that door for almost half an hour. Margaret answered what she chose to answer and let the rest go. Not rudely, not with any edge, just with the flat patience of someone who had made peace with the limits of what she was willing to explain. When Daniel finally asked directly what was in Calvert's Hollow that required every window to be sealed with 3 layers of lumber, Margaret was quiet for long enough that he heard something shift on her side of the door. A small sound, like a weight being moved from one foot to the other. Then she said, "You'll understand better if you stay until dark." Daniel wrote in his journal that night, "I should have taken that as the warning it was. I think part of me knew it was a warning. I stayed anyway." He set up a basic camp near the car, in the open ground between the road and the nearest building. The light was already beginning to drop. And in the settlement around him, behind all those sealed windows and braced doors, everything was perfectly, completely, deliberately silent. Daniel didn't hear it arrive. That's the part that stayed with me longest when I first read through the journal. There was no sound of approach, no footsteps, no disturbance in the gravel, nothing that would have told a person something was moving through the settlement toward them. One moment the space between the buildings was empty, the next moment it wasn't, and Daniel, sitting with his back against the car door, a thermos of cold coffee in his hands that he hadn't actually been drinking from, just holding, became aware of this the way you become aware that a room has gotten darker, not through any single moment of change, but through the accumulated weight of something being different than it was. He wrote in the journal that his first coherent thought was that it was one of the residents, that someone had come out of one of the sealed buildings to speak with him, which would have meant a door opening, which he would have heard. But the mind reaches for the reasonable explanation first and holds on to it for as long as it can. He looked toward the shape in the gap between the two nearest structures. He wrote, "I registered the outline, and then I registered that the outline was not resolving into anything I had a name for. And then I registered that I had stopped being able to look at it directly, not because I turned away, but because my eyes kept moving off it, the way your eyes move off something that isn't producing the right kind of visual information." He described this with the flat precision of a man writing a technical report, and it is the most frightening sentence in the entire journal. More frightening than anything he wrote later, because it tells you exactly the moment when Daniel's professional framework made contact with something it couldn't process and began, very quietly, to fail. It moved once while he watched it, a single lateral shift from one side of the gap to the other, covering maybe 3 meters. He heard nothing when it moved, no displacement of air, no sound from the ground beneath it. He wrote, "The movement was not slow and it was not fast. It was simply complete. It was in one position, and then it was in another position, and the interval between those two states did not seem to contain what I would normally call motion." He put the thermos down on the gravel beside him. He didn't do this consciously. He wrote that he only noticed he had done it when he heard the small sound it made touching the ground and realized his hands were now flat against his thighs, pressing down, which is what his body did when it was trying to hold itself still. The thing stayed in the gap for what Daniel estimated was about 20 minutes. He did not look at his watch. He estimated afterward based on how much the light had shifted. The temperature kept dropping, or seemed to, though he couldn't be certain whether the cold he felt was a measurable drop or something else. The settlements around him remained in total silence. Every sealed window, every braced door, every building with its layers of careful lumber and iron hardware, all of it perfectly still, and behind all of it, nothing. No movement, no sound, no indication that anyone inside was aware of what was standing in the gap between the buildings, 12 meters from where Daniel sat against his car. That's the detail that unlocked something for me when I read it. Because of course they were aware. Of course they knew exactly what was out there. They had sealed themselves inside specifically because of what was out there. And they made no sound at all. Not a voice, not a child, not the creak of a floorboard. The silence from inside those buildings was not the silence of sleep. It was the silence of people who had learned, over a very long time, exactly how to be. When it finally moved away, he did not see it go. He was looking at the gap, and then he was looking at empty space, and the interval between those two states had the same quality as its earlier movement. Complete and without transition. He sat against the car for a long time after that. He wrote, quote, 17. Morning came to Calvert's Hollow the way mornings come to places that have been waiting through the dark. Slowly, grudgingly, the light arriving in stages rather than all at once. First a gray lifting of the black, then a pale wash across the tops of the sealed buildings. Then finally, reluctantly, actual daylight reaching the ground. Daniel was still sitting against the car. His lower back had locked up sometime in the early hours, and he straightened carefully, one hand on the doorframe. He wrote that the settlement looked completely ordinary in the light, worn and quiet, and a little neglected. The kind of place that's been doing without for a long time. But ordinary. He wrote ___, quote, __, 18 __. Margaret spoke to him first that morning. He hadn't approached the door. He was standing by the car, drinking water, trying to work out whether his legs were going to hold him properly. And her voice came through the boards, the same way it had the day before. Unhurried, level. She said, "You stayed." Not a question. He said he had. She said, "Most don't." He asked her how many people had come up the service road before him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Enough that we stopped expecting them to stay." He asked her what happened to the ones who left. She said, "They leave, that's all. They go back down the road." He asked if they were all right when they left. Another pause, longer this time. "Define all right," she said. And she said it without any edge, without any invitation to push further, just as a genuine question, like the word had stopped meaning something straightforward to her a long time ago. That exchange is in both documents, the journal and one of the unsent letters to Claire. In the letter, Daniel wrote about it differently than he did in the journal. In the journal, it's recorded like field notes. In the letter, he wrote, quote, 24. That version tells you more about where Daniel was by the second morning than anything in the official survey, because he was already thinking in her terms. He was already borrowing her framework without seeming to notice that he was doing it. He asked her that morning how long the community had been living this way. She said, quote, 25. He asked if that meant it had been this way for at least 3 generations. She said, quote, 26. He asked if anyone had ever tried to leave permanently, not just a visitor going back down the road, but an actual resident relocating, moving away, starting somewhere else. The silence that followed that question was different from the other silences. Heavier, like it had more than one thing in it. Then Margaret said, quote, 27. He waited. She didn't continue. He wrote in the journal that night, she said those 3 words, and then she simply stopped. Not reluctantly, not with any suggestion that there was more she could say but was choosing not to. She stopped the way you stop at the edge of something you're not willing to look over. He stayed for a second night. He had not yet been inside the community hall. He had not yet seen what was on its floor. He had not yet understood what the unlocked door in a settlement of sealed buildings actually meant. The symbols were already there when he found them. That's what got to me. Not that someone had carved them recently, not that they were fresh, but that they were old enough that the bark had grown partially back around the edges of some of them. The wood slowly trying to heal over the cuts the way skin closes over a wound, and in some cases, almost succeeding. Daniel found them on the second afternoon, during the window of daylight between his conversation with Margaret and the hour when the light started to drop and everything in Calvert's Hollow shifted into a different register. He had been walking the perimeter of the settlement, doing what he told himself was a standard boundary assessment, mapping the extent of occupied structures, noting which buildings showed active use through chimney smoke and which appeared dormant. In the journal, he was more honest. He wrote, "I was checking the edges. I needed to know where the settlement ended and something else began." The tree line was about 40 meters from the outermost buildings on the settlement's north side. The ground between was open, flat, the kind of scrubby transitional land you get at the edge of managed space, where nobody has actively maintained anything in years. Weeds, some dead grass flattened by old snow, a few fence posts with no wire between them anymore. Daniel walked to the tree line because he wanted to see what was on the other side of it, which was more trees, as it turned out, and then more trees after that. The forest doing what forests do in that part of the country, going on and on without any particular interest in being finite. He found the first carving on the fourth tree in from the edge, a spiral cut cleanly into the bark at roughly chest height, the lines even and deliberate, curving inward to a center point, and then, just before reaching it, breaking off into a horizontal stroke that ran counter to the direction of the spiral. He looked at it for a moment, and then looked at the next tree. The same mark. He moved along the tree line, checking each trunk in sequence. Every third tree carried the symbol, consistent in size, consistent in the placement of that interrupting horizontal line, consistent in the depth of the cut, which told him whatever tool had been used had been applied with the same pressure each time, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it many times. He counted 31 marked trees before the tree line curved and he lost his sight line. He did not continue around the curve. He wrote that evening, __quote _30 __. He photographed each marked tree with the small camera he carried for survey documentation. The photographs are referenced in the official survey as peripheral structural documentation and are not described further. They were not attached to the filed report. No copies have been located in any archive consulted in the preparation of this account. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A welfare field worker photographs 31 carved symbols forming a complete boundary perimeter around a sealed settlement, includes them in his official submission, and they are not in the filed report. Someone made a decision about those photographs. Someone looked at them and decided they belong somewhere other than the permanent record. The second thing Daniel noticed about the marks, after their regularity and their age, was the direction they faced. The spiral on each tree opened outward toward the forest, not inward toward the settlement. Whatever the marks were communicating, they were communicating it in the direction of the trees, not in the direction of the buildings behind them. He wrote one line about this in the margin of his journal, in smaller handwriting than the surrounding text, like he'd added it later, after sitting with it. He wrote, "A sign facing outward is not a warning for the people inside. It is a term addressed to whatever is outside," which means whoever made these marks expected the thing outside to be able to read them. He underlined the last 4 words, just those 4. Then he closed the journal and went back to his car and waited for dark. Now here's where the account fractures. The official survey has 11 pages missing. I told you that at the beginning, and I want to come back to it now because we are at the point in the timeline where those pages should begin. The section covering the second and third nights. The section that was removed with a straight-edged blade by someone with access to the filed report and a reason to remove it. What survives from that period is the journal. And I need to be honest with you about what the journal is like from this point forward. because it changes. The handwriting doesn't deteriorate the way it would if Daniel were physically unwell or exhausted beyond function. It changes differently. It becomes more compressed, the letters smaller and closer together, like he was trying to fit more onto each line than the line could hold. And the structure of the sentences changes. He stops completing thoughts in the way he had been completing them. He starts a sentence, and then interrupts it with a different sentence, and then returns to the first one several lines later. Reading it feels like listening to someone talk while they're watching something else, their words running slightly ahead or behind what their attention is actually on. The first entry from the second night begins mid-thought, as though he had been writing for some time before this page, and the earlier pages are missing, which they are not. The binding is continuous. The page before this one ends with a complete sentence about the temperature dropping. The entry reads, "It was waiting for me to look." The difference from last night is that last night I was not certain it was aware of me specifically. Tonight, I am certain. It was waiting for me to look. And then a gap of several lines, the pen lifted and replaced, and then in slightly different pressure, slightly different angle, like the hand holding the pen had shifted. And I looked. That phrase appears 7 times across the next 2 pages, not consecutively, not in a list, but woven into fragments of other observations, as though it kept surfacing in his thinking regardless of what else he was trying to record. He wrote about the temperature. He wrote, "And I looked." He wrote about the sound the gravel made when the wind moved across it. He wrote, "And I looked." By the 7th instance, the handwriting around it is compressed to the point where some of the surrounding words require effort to parse. But those 3 words are clear every time, written with a steadiness that suggests he was not confused about them, that he knew exactly what he was writing, and kept returning to it because he had not yet found what came after it. I spent a long time with those pages, longer than I should have. There's something about repeated text in a document that was clearly not intended for anyone else to read, something that makes you feel like you're not just reading it, but being read back. Like the repetition is a kind of pressure, and the pressure is directional. I set the journal down at a certain point and walked away from my desk and made coffee and stood by the window for a while. And when I came back and opened it again to the same page, the phrase was still there, 7 times, clear as anything. And the page after it is the one where his handwriting changes back to something closer to normal, where he starts describing what he found in the community hall and what was on its floor and what happened when he went inside. That section exists. It is legible, and it is what I am going to tell you next. Somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd night, Calvert's Hollow started singing. Not one voice, all of them. Every sealed building, every braced door, every window with its layers of careful lumber. And behind all of it, coming through the wood and the insulation and the plaster and the cold air between, a sound that Daniel described as the most unsettling thing he had encountered in 3 days of consistently unsettling things. Not because it was loud, because it was coordinated, because it moved between the buildings like a single thing produced by many mouths, rising and falling with a deliberateness that had nothing accidental in it. And because no matter how long he listened, he could not place the language. He had working knowledge of 4 languages. He had spent years traveling through communities that spoke regional variants, local dialects, old forms of speech that hadn't made it into any textbook. He knew what unfamiliar languages sounded like, the particular quality of hearing words you can't parse, the way your brain keeps reaching for a foothold and not finding one. This was not that. This was something his brain did not reach for at all. It did not try to parse it. It simply received it, the way you receive a low vibration through the soles of your feet when you're standing near something very large that is running. He wrote, "It is not addressed inward. There's a directionality to it that I can feel more than hear. It is going somewhere. It is aimed at something. And whatever that something is, I think the sound reaches it." He wrote that on the last fully coherent page before the handwriting changes. I want you to hold that detail, the directionality, the sense that the sound had a destination, because it becomes relevant later, in a way that Daniel himself may not have fully understood when he wrote it. What I can tell you is that the singing lasted for what he estimated was 2 hours, and that when it stopped, the stopping was simultaneous across all the buildings. Not one voice trailing off after another, but all of them releasing at the same instant, like a signal had been given that Daniel couldn't hear. The silence after it was different from the silence before it. Emptier, somehow. Like something had been present that was now not present, and the air was adjusting to the absence. He did not sleep that second night either. He sat with his back against the car door, the same position as the night before, and he watched the gap between the two nearest buildings, and whatever had been there the previous night was not there in the same way. But he was not certain the space was empty. He wrote, "Morning came, and he was still there, still sitting, still watching. And when the light reached the ground of Calvert's Hollow, and the settlement began its strange version of ordinary again, Daniel did something he had not done in 2 days of being in this place. He stood up, picked up his survey bag, and walked directly toward the community hall, not toward Margaret's door, not toward any of the sealed buildings, toward the one door in the entire settlement that had no boards across it, the one that stood slightly ajar, as it had since the moment he arrived, in a way that was now impossible to read as anything other than intentional. He stopped 3 meters from it. He wrote later that he stood there long enough that the cold worked through his jacket and into his shoulders, and that he was aware of this physical discomfort in a very specific way, grateful for it, using it as evidence that he was still located in his body, and his body was still located in the ordinary world. Then he pushed the door open and went inside. The community hall was plain in the way that spaces are plain when they have been emptied of everything except their essential function. Benches along 3 walls, the kind made from raw timber with no finish on them, worn smooth by use over a long time. A small iron stove in one corner, cold, no ash in it, like it hadn't been lit in a while. A single window, boarded like all the others, so the only light came from the open door behind him and a narrow gap at the window's upper edge where one plank had warped slightly away from the frame. The floor was wide planking, dark with age, and in the center of it was what Daniel had come to find, though he would not have said so if you had asked him, because he did not know yet that he had come looking for it. The pattern on the floor covered an area maybe 4 meters across. It had been made with something dark, not paint, something that had been worked into the grain of the wood over time, applied and reapplied until it had become part of the material rather than something laid on top of it. A series of spirals, the same form as the marks on the trees at the boundary, but here multiplied and connected, one feeding into the next, the whole thing forming a shape that his eye kept trying to organize into something familiar and kept failing. It was not a circle. It was not a grid. It was something that required a logic he did not have to see all at once. He crouched at the edge of it and moved his flashlight across the surface slowly, following one line with the beam until it merged with another line, and then continuing along the new line until it merged with another. And he wrote that he did this for a long time, much longer than he intended, and that somewhere in that process his attention shifted from the act of following the lines to the act of knowing where they were going before the light reached them. He stopped moving the flashlight. He wrote, quote, 38. He stayed crouched at the edge of the pattern for a long time after that, not moving, not speaking, not writing. Then he stood up slowly and turned around, and understood that he was no longer alone in the room. He knew before he turned around that turning around was going to change something permanently. That's not a dramatic way of putting it. That's exactly what Daniel wrote, in plain language, in the journal entry that covers what happened next. He wrote, quote 39, quote, he turned anyway. The survey bag was still in his hand. He noted that detail specifically, the weight of it against his fingers, the familiar texture of the strap, like he was cataloging the last ordinary sensations available to him before something else began. What filled the doorway was not fully inside the room and not fully outside it. It occupied the threshold in a way that made the threshold feel like the point, like the doorway was not incidental to where it was standing, but was precisely, deliberately where it had chosen to be. Daniel did not describe its appearance in the way you would describe a person or an animal, not with features or a shape you could hold in your mind afterward. He described it the way you describe something that your eyes can process, but your brain cannot store. Something that your visual system registers and your memory immediately begins to lose. He wrote, quote, what he could describe, and did in careful detail, was what it did, which was almost nothing. It did not move toward him. It did not make a sound. It did not gesture or signal or produce any behavior that Daniel's framework for understanding living things had a category for. It simply attended to him. That was the word he kept coming back to in the journal. Attended, the way a doctor attends to a patient, fully present, focused, taking in information. He wrote that it felt like being read, not observed, read, like whatever was standing in that doorway was processing him at a level that had nothing to do with his surface, his clothing, his face, the survey bag in his hand, like it was reading something further in than any of that. He stood with it for what he estimated afterward was maybe 5 minutes. He could not be certain because his sense of duration had become unreliable inside that room. It felt both shorter and longer than 5 minutes simultaneously, which is not a thing that time normally does, and he noted this without trying to explain it. At some point during those minutes, he became aware of something he had not expected. He was not underneath the fear, which was present and substantial, and he did not minimize it. He was not feeling threatened. He wrote about this with the care of a man who understood how strange it sounded and wanted to be precise about it anyway. He wrote, the distinction I am trying to draw is not that I felt safe. I did not feel safe. I felt seen, which is not the same thing at all, and in some ways is more disorienting than a threat would have been, because a threat gives you a role. You know what you are in relation to a threat. Being seen like that, at that depth, by something that has no equivalent in any experience I can reference, gave me no role at all. I was simply a thing being attended to. And then, for a reason I cannot identify, the attending stopped. It withdrew from the doorway without moving in any way he could track. One moment the threshold was occupied. The next, it was not. The room felt different immediately. Not warmer exactly, but less pressurized, like something that had been holding a specific tension had let it go. Daniel stood in the same position for a while longer. Then he looked down at his hand and realized he had been holding the survey bag so tightly that the strap had left a deep red mark across his palm. He had not felt that happening at all. He walked to the doorway and stood where it had stood, looking out at the settlement in the afternoon light. The gray sky, the sealed buildings, the flat, scrubby ground between the structures, all of it looking ordinary again, in that way he had stopped trusting. He wrote one line in the journal before he left the community hall, and did not add to it until he was back at the car. He wrote, "It let me look at it. The question I cannot answer is whether that was indifference or intention." That question is the one I keep returning to, because the answer changes everything about what Calvert's Hollow is and what Daniel's presence there meant. If it was indifference, if he simply happened to be in a space it used and it paid him no more attention than you pay a fly in a room you're passing through, then his time there was incidental. A welfare worker who wandered into something ancient and impersonal and was neither welcomed nor warned, just briefly noted and then forgotten. But if it was intention, if it chose to let Daniel see it clearly, chose to stand in that doorway at that angle with that quality of attention for those specific minutes, then a different set of questions opens up, and they are considerably less comfortable. Because intention implies purpose, and purpose implies that Daniel leaving Calvert's Hollow was not simply him deciding to go. It implies he was permitted. And the thing about being permitted to leave is that it tells you something about who controls the terms of your presence in a place. It tells you the permission was not yours to give yourself. He walked back to the car. He picked up the journal. He wrote for a long time without stopping, and when he finally put it down and looked up, the light was gone, and the settlement was dark, and from somewhere inside one of the sealed buildings, very quietly, the singing had started again. Daniel left Calvert's Hollow at a walking pace, and that detail, so small, so easy to miss, is the thing that tells you more about those final minutes than anything else he wrote. Not running, walking, deliberately, measuredly, with a specific quality of someone who understood that the manner of their leaving was not incidental, that it was being observed, and that the terms of the observation mattered. He wrote about it that night, from a distance he does not specify in the journal, sitting in the car with the engine off and the heater running, and both hands flat on his thighs, the same position his body had found on the first night when it was trying to hold itself still. He wrote, quote, 43. He had woken that third morning with a decision already made, not formed during the night, not arrived at through deliberation, just present when he opened his eyes, complete and settled, the way some decisions are when your body has been working on them while you were elsewhere. He was going to leave. He was going to collect his equipment, his bag, his camera, the journal, and he was going to walk to the car and drive back down the service road, and not stop until the tree line was behind him and the ordinary countryside was around him again. He did not go to Margaret's door. He did not announce his departure. He wrote later that this felt important, not as a matter of courtesy, but as a matter of navigation. Like saying goodbye out loud would have constituted a different kind of act than simply leaving, and he was not certain he understood the difference well enough to risk it. He packed slowly, deliberately, checking each item before it went into the bag, the way you check things when part of your attention is elsewhere, and you don't trust yourself to remember later. Survey equipment, camera, notebook, the lens cloth he kept in the front pocket, the spare pen. He zipped the bag and lifted it and slung it over one shoulder and stood for a moment beside the car. The settlement was doing its daytime version of quiet around him, that flat, gray, almost ordinary quiet that he had stopped being fooled by 2 days ago. The chimneys had their thin threads of smoke. The sealed windows showed nothing. The community hall door stood ajar, as it had since he arrived. That particular openness that he now understood was not passive, not an oversight, not a remnant of ordinary life before the sealing began. It was a position maintained with intention, like a term in an arrangement that had to be kept current. He did not look at it for long. He opened the car door and put the bag on the passenger seat, and then stood with one hand on the roof of the car and looked at the settlement one final time. He wrote, quote, 44. He got in. He turned the key. The engine started, which, he noted, felt like a small act of mercy from a universe that had not been particularly merciful for the past several days. He drove to the edge of the settlement and turned onto the service road and did not look in the rearview mirror. He wrote that this was not bravery. He wrote, __quote _45 __. He knew it was behind him. Not behind the car, behind him personally, in the way that something can be oriented toward you regardless of physical direction. He felt it the same way he had felt its attention in the community hall, as a pressure, faint but unmistakable, against the back of his neck and shoulders. It tracked him to the tree line. He was certain of this without being able to explain the certainty, the same way he had been certain of the pattern on the floor before his flashlight reached it. And then, at some point in the first kilometer of Forest Road, the pressure lifted. Cleanly, completely, like a hand that had been resting lightly on your shoulder, removing itself. He wrote, __quote _46 __. He drove for 20 minutes before he realized his headlights were off. Not that they had failed, not that he had forgotten to turn them on in the morning. They had been on when he left the settlement. At some point in those first 20 minutes of Forest Road, he had turned them off without any awareness of doing so. He pulled over, turned them back on, sat with his hands on the wheel for a moment. Then he drove to the nearest town with a motel and took a room and sat at the small desk by the window and wrote for the rest of the day without stopping. The official welfare survey was submitted within the week. It was received by the regional authority and logged with a standard processing reference and assigned a case number that begins with the same prefix as several hundred other rural community assessments filed that year. No one called Daniel to discuss it. No one requested a follow-up. The survey was processed and filed, and the processing and filing took less time than it takes to drive the service road to Calvert's Hollow. Daniel wrote about the submission in the unsent letter to his sister Claire, the one recovered from his apartment after he stopped responding to his supervisor's messages. He wrote, quote, 47. He noted in that same letter that 3 of the 11 pages covered the first day. 2 covered the journey and the initial assessment of the settlement's condition. The remaining 6 compressed everything else, 2 nights and a 3rd morning, and what he saw in the community hall, and what stood in the doorway, into language that the regional authorities' filing system could absorb without producing any particular response. He wrote, quote, 48. What he did not write in the letter, what appears only in the journal and only in the compressed, interrupted handwriting of those middle pages, is what he actually put in the survey's observations field. the field that he left blank in the official document, the field where he wrote, in the journal version, only this: Site presents conditions that do not have a classification in the current assessment framework. Recommend no further action. 3 other welfare workers were sent into the same Northern Territory after Daniel, and not one of them came back the same, though the system recorded all 3 as routine returns and asked no questions about any of them. I found their personnel files in the same archive transfer that produced Daniel's documents, and I want to be clear that I was not looking for them. I was cataloging. I was doing the dull, methodical work of cross-referencing case numbers from the regional authority's quarterly logs against the survey submissions on file. The connections surfaced on their own, the way patterns surface when you spend enough time with a large enough body of documentation. Quietly, without announcement, like something that had been waiting for someone to look in the right direction. The first worker sent after Daniel was a man named Gary. His assignment came roughly 4 months after Daniel's survey was filed and processed. Gary's report on the Northern Territory is thorough and competent, and covers 7 communities in detail. Calvert's Hollow is not among them. There is a line in the appendix, a single line with a case reference attached, that reads __, quote, _50, __. The case reference attached to that line matches the case number on Daniel's original survey. Gary knew what was up that road. He drove to the point where the service road forks, and he turned around, and he wrote 1 line about it in an appendix and moved on, and nobody at the regional authority noticed or asked. He continued in the welfare service for another 2 years, and then took a desk position and stopped doing field work. His personnel file gives no reason. His file also contains a medical notation from around the time of the Northern Territory assignment, a single visit to an occupational health advisor. The advisor's notes are brief. They record that Gary described difficulty sleeping and, separately, a persistent sense of being watched in open spaces. The advisor recommended rest. Gary did not return for a second appointment. The second worker sent into that region was a woman named Diane. Her report does not reference Calvert's Hollow at all, not even in an appendix. She covered 6 communities and submitted clean, detailed documentation on all 6. But in the regional authority's internal routing log, there is an entry from the week of her northern assignment, a note added by whoever processed her expense claim that records a mileage discrepancy. She claimed mileage consistent with visiting 6 communities. The routing log calculates, based on the communities she listed and their locations, that she actually drove considerably further. The difference is exactly the distance from the main route to the North Spur Fork and back. She drove to the fork. She did not file anything about it. Nobody followed up on the mileage discrepancy. It was noted and initialed and left in the routing log where it has been sitting ever since, quietly, waiting for someone to notice it the way I noticed it, which is to say, by accident, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, with a cup of cold coffee at my elbow, and no particular expectation that the number would mean anything. The third worker is the one who stays with me. His name was Peter, and he returned from the Northern Territory assignment in what his supervisor described in a brief internal memo as apparently good health, alert, responsive, no obvious signs of distress. He submitted no report. He told his supervisor he needed a few days to write it up, which was not unusual for a multi-community survey, and his supervisor said that was fine and went back to other things. 9 days later, Peter sent a resignation letter by post, not by email, by physical post, handwritten, addressed to the regional director. The letter contained 4 sentences. It thanked the authority for the opportunity to do meaningful work. It stated that he was resigning effective immediately. It noted that he was in good health and that the decision was his own and was not related to any incident or grievance. And then, in what appears to have been an afterthought, added below the signature in slightly different pen pressure, as though he had put the letter down and then picked it up again, a single additional line. He wrote, ___, quote, _ 51 ___. No statement was requested from him. No exit interview was conducted. The letter was filed. Peter's forwarding address was not recorded. I have found no further trace of him in any document consulted during the preparation of this account. Calvert's Hollow was removed from the active survey map in a routine cartographic update that processed dozens of reclassifications simultaneously. The notation applied to the settlement reads, ___, quote, _ 52 ___. It is initialed by an administrator whose name I cannot read from the scan. No inspection accompanied the reclassification. No site visit was recorded. No description of current conditions was attached. The settlement simply moved from one column of a spreadsheet to another, and the spreadsheet was saved and closed, and nobody opened it again until I did, which was not part of my assignment, and which I did not report to anyone. Here is what I know about how places like Calvert's Hollow persist. They persist because the systems designed to address them are built on the assumption that every problem has a form, that every condition can be categorized and routed and processed into a response. And when something arrives that the form cannot hold, the system does not break. It does not ask questions. It does not escalate. It finds the closest available category, applies it, and moves on. The closest available category for Calvert's Hollow was weather-related access disruption, and then time constraints, and then reclassified. And each of those categories was technically applicable, and each of them was a way of not saying what was actually there, and the system accepted all of them without any friction at all. That is not a failure of any individual person. Ruth did not cover anything up. Gary did not lie. The administrator who reclassified the settlement did not know what they were reclassifying. The system simply has no mechanism for processing what it has no language for. It routes around the gap the way water routes around a stone. It doesn't question the stone. It just keeps moving. And the thing in Calvert's Hollow has never needed to do anything about that. It has never needed to act or conceal itself or neutralize the people who came up the service road. It just needed to be what it was in a place that the available frameworks could not accommodate. The rest happened automatically. The rest was just human institutions doing what human institutions do, finding the most frictionless path through the available paperwork. It waited. The paperwork did the rest. What I cannot stop thinking about is the floor of the community hall. Not what it meant, not the pattern itself, but the specific thing Daniel wrote about it. That he knew where the lines were going before his flashlight reached them. That he recognized it in the way you recognize a route your body has memorized. Because Daniel had never been to Calvert's Hollow before that week. He had never seen that floor. Whatever he recognized from somewhere else. And in the letter to Claire, the unsent one, the one recovered from his apartment after he stopped answering calls, he wrote one line that appears in neither the survey nor the journal. He wrote, "The worst part is not that I recognized it. The worst part is that recognizing it felt, for just a moment, like coming home. And I have spent every day since trying to understand what that means. I hope very much that I don't." Daniel Marsh stopped writing after that letter. Not the journal, not the survey, not professional correspondence of any kind. His last recorded communication is a brief text message to his sister Claire, sent the evening he mailed the letter, which she did not receive until days later. The message says only, "I'm fine. Don't worry about the letter." She received the letter. She has not spoken publicly about its contents beyond confirming it exists. She confirmed this in a brief email to me, which I did not expect her to send, and which I have read many times since. At the end of it, she wrote, "He always came home from difficult assignments. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He always came back. He came back from this one, too. He just didn't come back the same way he left. And I don't know how to explain the difference, except to say that the person who walked back in through my door was using all the same words and making all the same gestures, but something in the space behind his eyes was somewhere else. Like he'd left a part of himself up that road, and what came back was everything except that part." The service road to Calvert's Hollow still appears on some older regional maps that were not updated after the reclassification. The fork in the road is still there. The North Spur is still passable, according to a road condition survey conducted several years ago for an unrelated infrastructure assessment. That survey notes the spur as __quote _56__. The terminus condition is unknown because nobody has gone to check it, not officially. The archive has no record of anyone traveling that road since Peter drove to the fork and turned around. Whether the community hall door is still ajar, whether the marks on the trees at the boundary have continued to be maintained, whether Margaret still stands close to her boards and speaks to whoever arrives in a level voice about the nature of the waiting. These are questions that no document in this archive can answer. They are questions that would require someone to drive the North Spur to its end. And I have been sitting with Daniel's file for long enough now that I understand, in a way I did not understand when I began, exactly why nobody has. Here is what this account leaves me with, and I think it is the most honest thing I can say about it. We assume that the things we cannot explain are simply things we haven't explained yet. We assume that the gap between what we understand and what exists is temporary, that it will close, that language and documentation and the right form in the right office will eventually reach everything. Calvert's Hollow suggests that this assumption has a limit, that there are territories, not metaphorical ones, actual places on actual roads, where the gap does not close because it was not created by a lack of knowledge. It was created by something that exists in a different relationship to knowledge entirely, something that has been there since before anyone arrived to name it, and that will be there after every form has been filed and every map has been updated and every welfare worker has written their final line and closed their journal for the last time. The prior claim, as the old accounts call it, was not made by the settlers. It was already in place when they arrived, and the terms, every independent source agrees, are ongoing. Now I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer. If you drove that service road tomorrow, If you turned onto the North Spur and followed it to its end and found a community of people living sealed inside their homes, singing in a language nobody can identify, tended to each night by something that the available frameworks have no name for, and you had a welfare assessment form in your bag and a filing system waiting for your report, what would you write in the observations field? Not what you should write, what you actually would write. Because Daniel left that field blank, and I think he was right to. And I think the reason he was right is the most frightening thing in this entire account. Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. If this account stayed with you, please subscribe and leave a like. There are more files in this archive. There are more roads that stop appearing on maps for reasons that the reclassification notices do not explain. We are still looking. And some of what we find, we cannot unfind.